Thank you all for coming out this evening, and I want to thank the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary and the Channel Islands National Park for taking an interest in this issue, which is the fact that marine mammals and other organisms in the Channel Islands area may be sensitive to the presence of ambient noise. And so let me just see how I'm going to do this technology here. Okay, I have a pointer. So one thing that the area around the Channel Islands, we're kind of blessed because we're at the receiving end of the California Current, which is a cold water current that brings water down from the Alaska area, and it creates an environment for a very rich ecosystem. It creates an environment for upwelling of nutrient-rich waters, and which creates a setting for phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then the animals that feed on those. And so we're quite lucky. The range, the diversity of marine mammal species, and also just the sheer density of these species. And so here I've shown a collection of some of the baleen whales that we have in this area, and the granddaddy of all baleen whales is the blue whale, which is the largest animal to ever inhabit the Earth. And we have a really robust population of blue whales just off the coast here. And I'm not sure people even understand how, in terms of accessibility of these animals to an urban area, this is the place in the entire planet. There are many places where blue whales, were prevalent they were taken down to very low numbers by commercial whaling. And we have a population of around 2,000 animals, and in the summer they're quite accessible here. The same way in this season, we see the gray whales passing by, really right by our doorstep, twice. They're going south in the winter and coming back north in the spring. And as well, we have a population of fin whales that are more or less resident in the area, and humpback whales that come here in the summer and the fall. So we're really quite blessed, and this also translates into a rich population of odontocetes, that is the toothed whales, the most common being the common dolphin, and then seasonally we see the white-sided dolphin and Rizzo's dolphin. There are coastal bottlenose, and also seasonally the right whale dolphin. So the presence of these animals depends on this entire ecosystem. And of course we can't forget the pinnipeds. And this is a photograph from the Children's Cove in La Jolla, right? Which makes them very accessible. It's controversial, but accessible. And then others, elephant seals, fur seals, California sea lions, and then not as well known because they inhabit deeper waters, but still present in serious numbers in this area are beaked whales. This is Cuvier's beaked whale, which is probably the highest population of beaked whales, and Baird's beaked whale, and just to show how mysterious some of these deep diving animals are, the Pygmy beaked whale has only been known for about a decade. It's just recently described animal. And so, and in fact, we're discovering new species of beaked whales all the time. So it's quite impressive that these megafauna, can be present here, and we're just figuring out that they're actually are present. Now, all of these animals have an extensive use of sound, some more than others, but underwater, sound is a really important way to communicate and also to sense your environment. And so that also means that the animals are going to be sensitive to the sound environment around them. And much of this talk will focus on how anthropogenic sounds that we've made, especially by shipping, are changing the sound environment of this area. So in this slide, I'm talking about how the different kinds of marine mammals use different sounds, and the odontocetes have a very specialized anatomy which is developed in their foreheads to create echolocation clicks. These are impulsive sounds that they use to range, and I'm going to play a set of these clicks. Now that was a little bit quiet. So I'm going to do that again with your indulgence here. Hang on just a second. I am going to turn up my sound so that we can hear that a little better. Okay, let's try that again. Sounds like a creaky door, right? A series of clicks rapidly produced. They allow the animal to judge the range to an object by the time that it takes to reflect and come back. Now, that's good for foraging, but if you want to talk to your friends, you use this kind of sound. These are whistles, and for those of you who have really good ears, or in fact for all of us, they're at the upper range of human hearing, right? They tend to be in the upper frequency band above sort of 10 kilohertz. And generally those are used for communication between individuals and also possibly for some sort of sensing of the environment in a different way than what you would sense with the echolocation clicks. Now, the most popular whale sounds come from mysticetes, come from baleen whales. And in fact, the most popular baleen whale sound is the song of the humpback whale. There is in fact a gold album that was cut in the 70s from this. So I'm going to play a short piece of a humpback whale song. These are sounds produced in patterns. So there's a cycle where the sound repeats. And the cycle can be anywhere from 5 minutes to 15 minutes. And within that, there are units and phrases. I mean, it very much is a musical notation that the whales have. And we recognize this. I mean, this is why it could be a best-selling album. And these sounds in general are made by males, and they're singing to attract mates, to convince mates that they're the right one to breed with, which I think is maybe some component of what it is to be a rock star, although I've never tried that myself. So now let's talk about the background sound in the ocean and how things have changed with the introduction of anthropogenic sounds, in particular shipping. And this is a curve. Acousticians love these kind of plots because what it shows on one axis is frequency, and then here's the intensity of the sound on the other axis. And so the entire plot, what it says, the fact that it's going up to the left, is that there's more sound energy at low frequency than there is at high frequency. And of course, the hearing capabilities of the animals very much follow this trend. And so the hearing is more sensitive for all of these animals as you go to higher frequencies. Now, the curves I've drawn here that are a whole series of lines are the background noise that you get as a function of the wind and waves. And you can imagine as it gets windier and more surface action, surface agitation, that the sound level goes up. And so these are sea states. So at sea state 1, which is relatively flat and calm, the ambient noise is significantly lower than it is up here at sea state 6. Now, I'm pointing to frequencies around 1 kilohertz, where most of the time the background noise is related to what the ocean is doing, although there can be sounds made by people. For instance, small boats are in this range, and some of the echo sounders are in this range. But at low frequencies, below about 200 hertz, independent of how strong the wind is blowing, the ambient noise in the ocean is almost always set by the presence of ships. And this is true almost anywhere you go. There are places you can find in the Southern Ocean where this isn't true, but anywhere off the coast of California, we've raised the ambient noise level because of the presence of ships as much as 10 or 20 dBs. And so if I said that it's 20 dBs noisier, that's saying that it's 100 times more noise power than what the animals are used to, what they evolved with primordially. Now, where is this coming from? Well, there are 3 main sources of anthropogenic sound. And the one that is most sort of distributed around the ocean are these commercial shipping vessels. And in fact, you here are at sort of the gateway of shipping into the west coast of the US, which is, I'll describe in a minute, but it is just south at LA and Long Beach Harbor. There also are sounds put into the water by sonars, and I've drawn a picture of a military sonar or an anti-submarine warfare sonar on the bow of a ship. And there are also sounds put into the water by seismic exploration, by the search for oil and gas deposits. So in this particular place, you're really at the boundary between where there's a lot of commercial shipping and there are a lot of marine mammals. And so I'm going to focus this talk on this issue. Though we have oil here, we're kind of blessed in the sense that there's been really no exploration for at least nearly 20 years. That may change in the future, but so far, in the last couple of decades, this hasn't been a problem. There isn't a lot of military activity here, but there is in other places in Southern California. Now, this is a map that comes from the Navy that's a model of where shipping traffic exists around the planet. And you can see that much as there is on land, in the ocean, there are highways of commerce between certain areas that create these zones where they're of high density of shipping. Now, we know that these arcs that we see here in the North Pacific, many of them are headed for Southern California, and they take a great circle route, which takes them almost up to Alaska, and then they end up in Japan or China or other Asian ports. And the commerce on this has really grown in the last couple of decades, and that's meant a real concentration of shipping right here in Southern California. But even saying that, the Atlantic is probably, for everything I'm going to say about the measurements that we've made here in Southern California, the Atlantic is equally on the same footing in terms of the density of shipping. And it's just, I think that in the last couple of decades, the Pacific trade has really caught up with where the Atlantic had been for some time before that. So if we look at U.S. ports, particularly related to container trades, which are these 20-foot cargo containers where much of the goods are coming in now, the two top ports for the container trade are the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which anyone who's visited the area knows for all intents and purposes it's the same spot. Right, there are two entities that control two sides. It's one is the left hand and one is the right hand, but combined, they're something like 17% of the total container trade coming into the U.S. They're a large fraction of it, and that really focuses this activity here. This is a picture from Google Earth looking down on Long Beach Harbor. You can see a container ship coming in, and then the various places where it will dock and offload. Now, to get to that spot, this is kind of a schematic of what I was showing you before from the Navy's model, but that last little bit, this little box right here, is predominantly the shipping lanes are coming through the Santa Barbara Channel and passing in or near the Channel Islands sanctuary. Now, this is a plot of actual ship locations as they're coming and going to the port. There's a tracking system that's Automatic Information System, or AIS, that's required on ships above a certain size, and it's basically a system that allows the Coast Guard and the port to anticipate the locations of the ship. But we've been exploiting the radio signals from this to track the ships as they come through the Channel Islands region to get a sense for the volume of traffic, the speed of the traffic, and the cycle of how they arrive. And so the green line here is the northbound traffic, and the red line is the southbound traffic. You'll notice these are quite concentrated into these shipping lanes. You'll notice also there's a bit of activity down here, and in general, oil tankers will go around the Channel Islands and approach the port to the south, whereas the container ships will go right through the channel. Now, here is a map of aerial surveys conducted by the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, and it's really, the effort is really focused in the sanctuary and around the islands. And these are dots of blue whales sighted on the surveys, and you can see there's quite a concentration along the north side of the islands, and there's a pretty good overlap, especially in this sort of eastern part of the channel, with the shipping lanes and the presence of the ships. So this is a conflict that has the potential for ship strikes, as we saw last summer with blue whales, but it's also a conflict in terms of the animal's use of sound and the production of noise by the shipping. Here's a photograph of a container ship coming through the Santa Barbara Channel, and I'm going to play a sound of the ship, just a recording. Kind of a chugga, 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 right? Well, there are two main contributions to the sound. The biggest is the production of bubbles, essentially, cavitation, by the rotation of the propeller. As the propeller goes around, that's what pushes the ship forward. There's a lot of power in that. It's opening up cavities, the cavitation, and the collapse of those bubbles create this sort of pulsing sound as the propeller rotates. And then there's also the internal machinery of the ship, diesel generators and this kind of thing that power the ship. And all of those are very well coupled to the water. You can hear it as this kind of machinery sound as it goes by. Now, and I mentioned this earlier, that if you look at the container trades over the last, say, not quite a decade here, the trade going across the Atlantic and the trade going from Asia to Europe have been reasonably level, but the trade going trans-Pacific, which is coming from Asia to the west coast of the U.S., has had a really dramatic increase in the numbers of ships and the volume of cargo. And so we started thinking about how would we assess how ambient sound had changed in the Pacific related to this shipping. And so what we found, and you would think that there must be some agency somewhere whose job it is to every year track noise in the ocean. Well, it turns out that it isn't. It seems to be sort of an overlooked parameter of the environment. And so what we did is we went back and we found that there was documentation of the installation of the Navy SOSUS arrays. These are arrays that were installed off the West Coast and also in the Atlantic, but in the Pacific and the Atlantic, to track submarines during the Cold War. And during the installation of these arrays, there were quite extensive assessments done of ambient noise at each of the sites where the SOSUS arrays would go in. Now, in other words, they wanted to have a site where they understood what the noise levels were. And so we found a place just off of San Nicolas Island where a very careful assessment had been done in the 1960s of ambient noise. And what was a classified document now has no strategic importance, so it could be declassified. And that gave us this blue curve of what the noise levels were in dBs versus frequency in the mid-1960s. So using data from that, we went back to precisely the same spot, put in a new instrument, and made a measurement in 2003 and 2004. And what we found was that at low frequency, that is below about 100 hertz, the noise level off San Nicolas Island is about 10 to 12 dBs higher than it was in the 1960s. And also, you could see there's this interesting bump, and that bump is produced by blue whales. Right? That is the noise, or that is the sound. It's not noise of the whales, it's the sounds produced by the whales. And you can see that they're about 5 dBs above the background level back in 1964, 65, 66. Now, if the whales were making exactly the same level of sound today, they would be drowned out in the background noise. So instead, the whales are still about 5 dBs above the background. And there are clearly two factors going on here. One is that there have been a recovery of the number. There are more whales today than there used to be. But I think a significant part of this is that the whales are responding to the background level and actually raising their own voices. And this is an effect in humans. You'd call this the Lombard effect. It's what you do in a cocktail party. And so the whales essentially are having to shout to be heard. I also might point out, I'll get into this a little bit later, that there's a shift. This is at 20-some hertz, maybe 20, 21, 22 hertz. It's now down at about 15, 16 hertz, and I'll give you my pet theory for why that is in just a minute. When we threw in all of the data we could find for ambient noise measurements in the Pacific, and here are 2 measurements made by the Navy at San Nick. Here's our measurement. Here are 2 measurements made by the Navy at Point Sur off Central California. Here are some new measurements made by the University of Washington. There's this steady trend of about 3 dBs per decade in ambient noise. And of course, since the noise wasn't primordial back in the 60s, there's about 10 dBs that we can document here, but there's probably at least another 10 dBs to get back to the primordial level. Now, let's think about what we know about ships and how ships have changed. And these are data that come from Lloyd's of London, that's the insurance company that tracks very carefully the trends in shipping. And the red curve at the bottom is the numbers of ships that Lloyd's has insured globally. And it's just about a doubling of the number of ships from the 60s to the time of our measurement. But at the same time, there's this parameter called the gross tonnage. And gross tonnage is a very strange thing because it really has to do with how many barrels you could stuff in the hold, right? Think, wooden ships and iron men and, stuffing barrels. Well, they still use the same, measure for modern ships in terms of it's like the volume that the ship can contain. And what this tells us is, at the same time the number of ships have doubled, the sizes of the ships, the gross tonnage, has gone up by a factor of 6. So there are more ships, they're bigger ships. Bigger ships are more powerful ships put more energy into the water, they are noisier. And in fact, a doubling in ships doesn't nearly explain the amount of sound we see. It's much more the fact that the ships are bigger now than they used to be. That's most of what's going on. So it says that we need to think about the sound level being put out by individual ships and not just the total numbers of ships. Here's a container ship, the Hanjin Marseille. It's actually kind of lightly loaded. It's probably done most of its port stops here. And when we make measurements of this, you can see the ship, just like ambient noise itself, has most of its energy down here at low frequency, and it's dropping off as you go to high frequency. But the impressive thing that we found as we made measurements to these ultrasonic frequencies is that there is, in elevated ambient noise, there's elevated sound coming out of these container ships, even up here at the sort of tens of kilohertz range, which is where you would expect the sounds of odontocetes, of the dolphins, to be. Smaller vessels, this is a whale watching vessel actually done in the Puget Sound region. It's a 49-person yacht used for whale watching, mostly of Puget Sound killer whales. And when we made measurements of this, the peak energy is not at the lower frequencies, but somewhat higher. But there's, again, significant energy up here at a few tens of kilohertz, which is the communication range of the dolphins. Now, this is a recording from an instrument that we have that sits in the Santa Barbara Channel and records 24 hours a day, and we hope to just sort of collect an ambient noise record for what's happening in the channel. It's just south of Santa Barbara. And now, in this case, we show frequency on this axis and time on this axis. So this is 24 hours. This is one day in the life of if you lived in the bottom of the channel, just south of Santa Barbara. And the color shows you the intensity of the sound at each of these frequencies. And what you see is each time there's a red spike that comes up from the bottom, there's some kind of commercial vessel that's passing by this instrument. And if you do the math, it's about one ship an hour, 24 hours a day. Although there is clustering, there's a bit more clustering at midnight and a bit more clustering at noon. Not sure we understand that, but I think if we talk to the port, they'll probably tell us, that has to do with when the ships come and go. Now, if you look at how this sound energy comes up, it's clearly can overlap. These are whistles of dolphins. These are dolphins passing by. They're echolocating up here. They're whistling down here, and you can see how the sound of a ship could overlap with the frequencies of the dolphin. But down here, this is just a bright band of red at the very lowest frequencies. And when we now think about the other inhabitants of the channel, namely baleen whales, and this is here's a container ship. This is a photo taken by the Channel Islands. You can see a whale that's he's surfaced because here's his breath, and he's just off the bow of the container ship. So this is a close approach, but you can, obviously there were closer approaches last summer. Now, this is a plot from our instrument. We're looking at the lowest 1 kilohertz of data, and especially at 100 hertz is where the sounds of these animals are. There's quite a lot of energy here, and I'm going to put in a blow up just in this band right here. If you take that band and add a blow up of just the lowest 100 hertz, and now I'm going to point to this spot right here that's kind of in between a couple of ship passages. You can still see some ship lines, but here are the calls of a blue whale, mixed in with the ship lines. I mean, there's clearly an overlap in frequencies between the sounds of the container ships and the sounds made by the whales themselves. Now, how loud is this in the Santa Barbara Channel? How might this affect the ability of the whales to communicate? And so we've got two curves here. There's a blue curve, which is what you get when there's no ship right at the instrument. There's ships around, but there's nothing right there at the instrument. And you can see you drop the sound level by 20 or 30 dBs by not having a ship right there. When a ship is present within a few kilometers of the instrument, then there's a sound level that's up here. And now, again, here are these lines that we get from the blue whale calls, and clearly the call, the receiver is picking up calls in the absence of ships. The calls are pretty much gone in the presence of ships. And this is probably true for the ability of the animals to generally hear each other's calls as well. Now, how do you rate, I'm saying you because, or we, how do we in the Santa Barbara area here rate in terms of worldwide noise? If we were a contest to be the noisiest place on the planet, which is a dubious distinction, I've put this red curve, which is when the ships are present here in the Santa Barbara Channel, and the noisiest place I could find to compare with this is at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, right? Now, Persian Gulf, you think oil tanker, right? There's a steady stream of oil tankers. That is the yellow line that's just a bit below where we are. Now, I've cheated a little bit here because, this is just a total average. Ours would come down to be pretty comparable to the Persian Gulf if you just averaged around the whole 24 hours a day. Now, the San Nicolas site that I mentioned earlier that the Navy had measured is down here. It's not right in the shipping lanes. It gets about 10 dBs or so of protection from that. Now, it turns out that near San Clemente Island, just to the west of the island, is a basin that the Navy uses as part of its test range, but there's essentially no commercial shipping that goes through that area. And so it's kind of a nice test case because the Navy doesn't want commercial ships going through there, and there's some time that Navy ships are there, but it doesn't have the ship traffic, and it's also an enclosed basin that kind of protects it from outside sounds. And when we made measurements there, this is what we found. And so to go from this is maybe your nicest spot in Southern California versus your noisiest, there's 40 dBs, and which is a really serious number. And I mean it is of concern in terms of long-term exposure of the animals to these really elevated sound levels in terms of just simple things like creating hearing loss, but certainly in terms of being able to communicate. So on this contest, if it is a contest to be the noisiest place on the planet, I mean we're in the running for the winners, or maybe I should say the losers. Okay, now I want to talk about a broader context. I mean, we've been talking about the sanctuary area, the Channel Islands area, and the marine mammals. I talked about the marine mammals who inhabit that area. And now it's very important to think of it not just as a postage stamp, right here, but as a regional ecological setting. And we have a really wonderful background to do this in California, and it's because in the 1940s, there was a collapse of the sardine fishery. And the state of California said, okay, you bright guys at Scripps, of course I wasn't there in '49, so they could call them bright guys, why don't you guys go and figure out why the sardines went away? So the state of California asked Scripps to go out and conduct this survey, and it actually started going all the way from the Canadian border up to the Oregon border, running a series of lines 4 times a year, doing net tows and water samples, and trying to figure out how the environment had changed so that there was a collapse of this fishery. And miraculously, this survey has been going on since 1949. It is the best environmental data set in the ocean anywhere on the planet. It's a wonderful data set. And the sad thing is, we still don't know why the sardines went away. But the good news is that we've learned about El Niños. We've learned about how the ocean is warming. We've learned about different regime changes. On decadal scales, things will shift back and forth. So we've learned a lot of good stuff. And unfortunately, the survey didn't include marine mammals until recently. And so I organized an effort to put marine mammal observers, both acoustic and visual, on these CalCoffee surveys. And so for the last 3.5 years, we've had the marine mammal data coming in as well as the environmental data. So what I'm going to show you are these, it's sort of a regional snapshot of the distribution of these animals. And our, at least one of my favorites, the blue whale here, these dots are color-coded based on the season. So the yellow dots are the summer and the orange dots are the fall. And you can see that blue whales love us in the summer and a little bit in the fall. And that there's a coastal, on-the-shelf distribution. But also, there's this really fascinating offshore distribution. If you just go right off of the Santa Barbara region, there's something really interesting out here that doesn't seem to happen out here. And I have to say, we don't quite yet understand this. Now, our friends, the fin whales, have that same offshore distribution as well as the on-the-shelf distribution. They also have dots of all colors. There are fall and winter and spring and summer. So this is telling us these guys are resident, which is quite nice. And so they have a different strategy than the blue whales, who only come up to these latitudes in the summer to feed, and then they go down to the equator to breed. But fin whales will be here year-round. Humpback whales, this is a really interesting concentration. And you can see off of Point Conception, this is a zone of really intense upwelling related to the California current. It's what bathes the Channel Islands region in these high nutrient and very productive waters. The humpbacks, boy, they seem to know where that is, and they just zero right in on it. The sperm whales are deep water. That's kind of no surprise, but every once in a while you'll find one on the shelf. Dall's porpoise. Dall's porpoise aren't well known to be down here, but our surveys have revealed that there's a certain season, especially the spring. They're cold water animals. They tend to come down when the cold water is here, spring and winter, with just a little bit of presence in the summer and the fall. Pacific white-sided dolphins, we think we've discovered that there are actually 2 kinds of these guys. There's a spring animal that's coming down that principally lives up north off the coast of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, comes into Southern California waters in the spring. And then there's a warm water version that comes up from Mexico in the summer and the fall. The common dolphin, lots of them. They're here all seasons, but they might be a little bit more offshore in the winter, a little bit more inshore in the summer. Rizzo's dolphin, again, they look like they're pretty much concentrated on the inner part of the shelf. So these are just a sort of a snapshots of where these animals are. We're thinking about the environment in which they occupy. But another aspect of this is to think about how these distributions may be affected by the presence or absence of ambient sound, of the sounds created by the ships. Now, there are two main ways of assessing marine mammal populations. And on the left here, I've shown the visual method. Here's one of my trusty graduate students with a pair of binoculars. And then the acoustic methods. Here's one of my trusty graduate students hunkered over a computer, listening to the sounds. And the more we've looked at these two methods and their strengths and their weaknesses, the more we realize that they really tell us about different aspects of the animal's lives. And the visuals, it is true, these are mammals. They have to come to the surface to breathe. You can see them. You can do a species ID. You can say something about the behavior when they do come to the surface. This is important. The sounds, they don't tend to make sounds at the surface. They tend to make sounds when they're submerged. And then the sounds are telling us about a behavior that we don't really have access to from our binoculars. There also are cases where it's quite easy to hear them and it's quite hard to spot them. And there are also cases where you can spot them, but they're not making any sound. And so the two techniques are really both vitally important to get a more holistic picture of the animal's behavior. So we've been developing what we call these high-frequency acoustic recording packages. They're just ways of putting a presence on the seafloor for a long period of time that sample all the way up to these frequencies used by dolphins for echolocation and all the way down to the frequencies used by the baleen whales for communication. We have terabytes of data storage. It sounds like a lot, but you'll have it in your wristwatch in a couple of years. So, we live by Moore's law, of course, where things just get faster and cheaper. Now, I want to talk a little bit more in depth about the blue whale. And so this is a spectrogram of a blue whale call. The principal energy is about at 100 hertz. So I want to play this call, and I hope that the speakers will do it justice here. It sounds like someone beating a drum. If you have subwoofers in a big auditorium, you can feel it in your chest, right? It's a powerful sound. Unfortunately, these speakers are not the best. But at any rate, this is used by males as a way of advertising themselves to females. If you put an instrument out in almost anywhere in the Southern California region, this sound is, here's the first part of this song that I just played. There's a second part that's a tone that slightly downsweeps. It repeats every minute or so. If you put an instrument out, you'll get about 90,000 calls of this song a year. And this has to do with just the fact that it's not 90,000 animals, but it's done repetitively as a way of a male saying, here I am, and I am the one that you want to breed with, and the characteristics of this song tell you why, and that is because I am big. Blue whale strategy is to get big. Now, there's a different call that's used as a way of keeping track. It's a call-counter-call. It's sort of, here I am, there you are, and I'm over here now, you're over there now, and it's done in these sort of back and forth pairs or trios of calls. And we call those D for downswept calls. So one way that we've learned about these calls is that we actually can attach little recorders onto the side of a blue whale. And here's one of my colleagues with his Mustang suit on and a pole. And at the end of the pole is a little recorder it's about not much bigger than this remote control, and it has suction cups like the suction cups you'd use to keep the ski racks on the top of your car. And then out of the water appears a billboard, this side of a blue whale, and you stick the pole out and attach the suction. Now, here's the blowhole, here's our tag, and we usually put it on close to the blowhole, or as close as we can get, and then it works his way back along the animal until he finally flicks it off with his tail. And it records the dynamics of the dive of the animal as well as the sounds. at the time I made this slide, this is a little bit old, but something like a quarter of the times we attach it to the animal is making sounds. Now, here's a recording where we put the tag on the animal in the afternoon, and it was diving deeply down to almost 200 meters, and at the bottom of these dives, the animal turns and does a series of lunges, upward lunges, and the upward lunges are feeding. It's opening its pleats, it's engulfing the krill and the water, and then squeezing the water out and keeping the krill, and it can make 4 or 5 of those lunges at each of these feeding dives. But you notice that while it's down there feeding, these colored dots are where it made calls. It's not calling. So there's a complementary nature to these behaviors, and partly this is because when it goes down so deep, at 200 meters, it has a 20th of the air that it has at the surface. It's been collapsed by the pressure, and so it doesn't have the air it needs to make the call. It has to be near the surface, and so what happened here is the sun went down, the krill came up, and then the whale went into a period where it was probably resting. It stayed near the surface most of the time, and then it would mix in some calls along with that. This was a male. He was actually paired up with a female, but he was probably still trying to impress her over the night. Now, this, I'm sorry for the faint slide, but these are the feeding dives. You can see this little bit of wiggliness at the bottom are the lunges, the feeding lunges. And then there are calls mixed in between each of these feeding dives. There are these downswept calls, and they do them as a call counter call. So the downswept calls are an indication of feeding animals. The song type calls are an indication of breeding animals. And what happens, the blue whales have a cycle where they're down at low latitude to have their calves in the winter, in warm water. Then they arrive in Southern California about May or June, and when they arrive, they're hungry, and they start immediately into feeding. And these green bars show us the calls of the feeding whales. And then as the season goes on, the interest in feeding goes down, and the interest in mating goes up, and that's the incidence of the song calls. So from the acoustics alone, we're learning about the behavior of the animals, but we also can take this and start to make a quantitative assessment of how many animals are present, and are they changing the time that they're here, year to year. And so this is an important aspect of being able to monitor this population. Now, one thing, I'm showing you here a detailed spectrogram. This is frequency again and time for one of these bits of the song. And this is the call that I played before, these sort of pulses, and here's the tonal call. And each year, as we studied these animals, we realized that the tonal call in particular, was shifting its frequency. It looked qualitatively the same, but quantitatively, every year the frequency was a little bit lower. And so we took the midpoint of the third line in this call, and we asked ourselves, okay, what is exactly the frequency at that point? And then we made a plot of every recording we could find. And these are our own recordings. And then we went back into the Navy archives. They were very nice to open that up. And you can see in 1963, this midpoint was at 66 hertz. And today, it's down at 47 hertz. And it's been a steady decline in frequency over the 40 years that we've monitored this. And in fact, a more cynical friend of mine suggested that we could predict the end of the world when this goes to zero, in the year 2030. But, they can't do this forever. And so we don't exactly know why this is, but I will give you a theory. And the theory has to do with the fact that in the late 60s, the animals had been commercially hunted, and they were present, but in lower numbers than they are today. So in the whaling era or post-whaling era, there was a very low density of animals. Now, if you're a male and you want to make your pitch to a female, you want your sound to project to at least some minimum number of candidate mates, right? In this particular picture we've drawn, there are 6 potential mates that are going to hear the sound of this whale. Well, as the density goes back up, now pre-whaling there was some high density, but then we thinned them out basically by commercial whaling, and now they're coming back. Then the distance to your 6 mates has decreased. So that means that you don't have to make a call that's quite as loud as it used to be, okay? Now, there's a trade-off between frequency, high frequency, you can make a louder call than you can in low frequency. Now, why would they want to go to low frequency? Well, it turns out that, and this is where I've had trouble publishing this particular thing, so bear with me, but it turns out that there are cross-species data that suggests that females prefer males with very deep voices. So, blue whales do the same thing. And so there's a tendency. One of the amazing things is these males must be listening and synchronizing to each other. When somebody else goes lower, okay, I gotta go low too, right? And they kind of track each other down. So anyway, it's an interesting pattern. I wish we actually really did understand it, and maybe someday we will. But we actually found this pattern on blue whales around the entire planet, not just off of California. Okay, so now let's talk about what happens. We know that the songs of the blue whale are to communicate to a mate. Imagine now if we start out at 1 meter away from the whale, there's a certain sound intensity. It decreases as you move away, and there's a certain place at which the background noise level crosses over the received sound of your potential mate. Now, if you said that the background noise level is here at this green bar, you could hear that song 1,000 kilometers away. And this certainly was the case, that you could have a whale off of California singing, and a whale in Hawaii would quite easily, back before the days of shipping, quite easily hear that song. Now, if you increase ambient noise by 20 dBs, as we think has happened almost across the whole North Pacific, the range at which you can hear your potential mate goes from 1,000 kilometers to 10 kilometers, right? That's a big number, and that's a significant impact on being able, to find each other. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about gray whales, just because they're so important right here, passing by us twice a year. And there's a population, this slide is a little bit old, it's more like about 20,000 animals now. They actually have not been doing well recently, and that not being doing well is mostly related to a retreat of the ice in the Bering Sea. This is where the animals go to feed. The ice-covered areas of the Bering Sea creates a really rich benthic habitat. The whales go up there and feed in that, but now with less and less ice, there's less and less area being created, this habitat for gray whales to forage. That's probably why the number's gone down, but also they're passing right by all of the industrial activity here along the coast of California. And twice a year, once southbound in the winter, and then northbound along about now. So here are the sounds of a gray whale. This is recorded in one of the breeding lagoons in Mexico. Whale sounds like a bongo. There's a snapping shrimp. The high, snappy sound are the little shrimp in the lagoon. So the gray whale has done a really interesting thing here. If you look at the spectrogram, the peak of that energy is a few hundred hertz. This is the bongo kind of sound. And the interesting thing is that if the whale were an acoustic engineer and asked to come up with a signal that would propagate well in shallow water, he has done a wonderful job, because higher frequencies get attenuated and lower frequencies interact more with the sediment in the sea surface and get attenuated. So this is an optimal sound to be heard in shallow waters, which is where these guys love to spend their time. Now, how might gray whales be impacted by sounds? And you can imagine that they might be particularly sensitive to sounds in their breeding lagoons. And this is a plot that was made from measurements done back in the 50s all the way to the 80s. In San Ignacio Lagoon is an area where there were studies done in the 50s looking at the numbers of adults and the numbers of cow-calf pairs. And at a certain point in the late 50s, a salt mine was introduced into the lagoon, and that activity went on. There was shipping related to that. There was also just the whole activity around the lagoon itself in terms of mining the salt. And eventually, the salt works went bankrupt. And the whales during this time abandoned the lagoon. Salt works went bankrupt a few years later. It took a few years for the whales to come back, and then there's been a steady increase. And I think this plot could actually be extended to this day. So this is a sense of the sensitivity of the animals to this kind of commercial activity. Another indication of this is that the Spanish reports from the harbor in San Diego describe a bay absolutely chock full of gray whales. There was a description of them being afraid to take a rowboat across the bay because they'd get hit by a gray whale. And so that clearly was a breeding lagoon. It's not today. I've not ever seen or heard of a gray whale in San Diego Harbor. There may be a few miscreants that get there, but it's certainly not a breeding lagoon. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the small cetaceans, the dolphins. And this is the common dolphin, Delphinus delphis. And the typical recording you get of these animals goes up to the human hearing range. And in that range, you have these whistles. This is kind of a pulsy kind of sound. But what we've done recently is make recordings that go all the way up into the ultrasonic band. This is up to 100 kilohertz. And our hearing stops here at about 20. And in fact, you see, we're not even recording high enough. We really ought to go maybe to 150 or 200 kilohertz. And there's an entire universe of echolocation clicks above here that's never really been open to study in the wild because of the bandwidth limitations. And we've broken through this. And here's another example for Pacific white-sided dolphin. If you listen to these, they're kind of are creaky kind of sounds. But if you go up above that, above our hearing range, then there are these echolocation clicks. And you can see there are even patterns in the clicks which we're using to allow us to say something about the identification of the species. From an unwatched recording, we can say, oh, that is the white-sided dolphin, just based on those clicks. Now, we have a series of recorders out here. This is the one I mentioned before in the Santa Barbara Channel. We have things off of San Clemente, Santa Catalina, Tanner Bank, Point Conception. And we can start to do assessments of how much these various species, this is actually Rizzo's dolphin, Grampus, and white-sided dolphin, how often are they present at these various sites? And the other thing we've been able to do is say something about how they use the site in terms of their echolocation and other sounds throughout a daily cycle. So these are plots for Point Conception, Santa Barbara, and Santa Catalina in terms of how often we hear echolocation clicks at different times of day. And so 0 and 24, this is midnight, and the shaded bar is all midnight, and this is the daytime. And you can see that 50% of the time, if you're sitting off of Point Conception listening, you will hear echolocation clicks at night. That percentage goes way down to less than 10% during the day. Same thing, Santa Barbara, here's the 50%, goes down in the middle of the afternoon to a few percent, and then Catalina, it's a similar but not quite so dramatic pattern. And so this is telling us something about the behavior of the animals, that the echolocation clicks are used for foraging. They're used to find their prey, and much of that must be taking place at night. In fact, where it's very difficult to study them with conventional visual techniques. So where are we? Well, we're starting to learn something about the relation between what we can learn from listening and what we can learn from watching. We're starting to learn a little bit about, although it's very beginnings of what is the impact of noise on the animals? How are they reacting to the noise? Something about long-term, how is their use of sound changed? And then we really need to stick with monitoring on the long term the ambient noise from things like shipping. Now, I just want to mention, this is a plug, okay, but I have a website called voicesinthesea.org. And on this website, you can learn more about these various animals. We try to have sounds for almost everything. There also are videos that talk about the sort of ecology of the animal, the sounds of the animal, and sort of the conservation status of the animal for many of these. And there's a Just for Kids that's actually pretty hard. That's a matching game in terms of sounds and animals. And what I might do if I can, I was working to get my computer on the internet and failing, but I think I have another one that I may be able to do that. So those of you who want to stay after, we can play with the website. But I encourage you to go and look at this and also send us feedback in terms of how you like this. So other than that, I'm done. Go ahead. Yeah.
Talk about sound in whales. This is internal gas moving from one cavity to another? There's no bubbles, right? There's not air.
No air is expelled, right? Now, there are two categories. The baleen whales make sound much the way we do. They have lungs filled with air, that's the bronchial side, and then there's a constriction, the vocal folds, they would call them. It's like our vocal cords. They push the air through that constriction, and that creates a vibration, which then gets transmitted out into the environment. So they're a lot more like we are. We're all mammals. The Odontocetes, especially this guy is amazing because they've invested a huge amount of their anatomy into making sound and receiving sound. About the forward third of a sperm whale is a sound-making apparatus. It actually makes its sound right here at the tip of its rostrum. The sound propagates back along a fat body that the whalers call the spermaceti organ because it's really nice oil. They could just dip it out with a bucket. Bounces off the skull, which looks really like a radar, almost like a radar dish if you've ever seen a sperm whale skull. And then comes out through the forward part through a series of what I would call acoustic lenses. The whalers call it junk because they couldn't dip the oil out because it was fibrous and non-fibrous alternate. So what this does is it creates a pencil beam. It's like a laser beam, like this thing, of sound, just a few degrees in beam width that makes a really intense sound in front of the animal. That's how they can find their prey, narrow in on it, and make the kill. And so all of the Odontocetes, the toothed whales that are hunters as opposed to grazers, these guys are grazers. Most of their sounds are used for communication as opposed to sensing the environment, although we can't actually say everything that they do with sound. But we know for certain that these guys, the clicks are made to sense the environment. So they have a specialized anatomy to produce sound and not the usual moving air out of their lungs, right? So I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but yeah.
What is your take on the current controversy on sonar having an adverse effect on marine mammals?
Yeah, well, there are, we're in our infancy in figuring all of this out. And it's been an interesting sort of evolving story because, different sonars, different animals, different settings. Where it's less controversial, where things are on fairly solid ground, are the impact of mid-frequency sonar on beaked whales, right? Beaked whales, that's this guy. That's a deep diving animal. And in particular, that guy, that's Xiphias cavarostris. That's actually the beaked whale that's mostly implicated in the strandings. So there are cases where a mid-frequency sonar is used, especially in sort of an enclosed channel. As the ship transits through the channel, there are strandings that are sort of phased to be, the ship is here in the morning, the strandings are here, the ship is here in the afternoon, the strandings are there. So that's not that controversial. But how it goes out to the other species, the actual mechanism for how the animals are stranding, is it a behavioral reaction? Is it a physiological reaction? Is unknown at this point. So it's something that I think, over the next decade or so, I hope that our understanding of it will increase. So we can be more specific and just not say sonar and marine mammals, but what kinds of sonar, what kinds of setting, what kinds of marine mammals. So, yeah.
How is it proven that the beaked whale, in fact, died or got affected by sonar?
It's the close association in time and space and not just one incident, but multiple incidents. And so in other words, you can track the passage of the ship and then track the sequence of the strandings. And it's not just one incident, but multiple incidents. And it's a consistent species, it's a consistent kind of setting. So that aspect of it is not particularly controversial. I mean, I think, even, generally the scientific community would agree that mid-frequency sonar and beaked whales, there is a connection in terms of creating strandings. Then the animals are stranded. In the most famous incident, which happened in the Bahamas, there were people on the beach who, an animal is if it stays on the beach, it is going to die. So people would take the animals, turn them around, and push them back out to sea, as a last-ditch effort to try to get them to stay alive. Those that stayed on the beach, obviously died. We don't actually know the fate of the animals that were pushed off, but when there were necropsies, autopsies done, there was a syndrome which looked much like decompression sickness, gas bubbles and fat bubbles. That is a leading theory for why that somehow the sonar is related to this decompression sickness-like syndrome. But the actual mechanism, how you get from a sonar to these gas and fat bubbles is totally unclear at this point. So.
But they're connected through frequency.
There is a certain frequency, you mean pitch, the pitch of the sonar. Yeah,
Pitch.
that's right. Well, the mid-frequency sonars are the ones that are implicated in the strandings. Yeah.
Was there other species of marine mammals in that testing area that were cited that were not affected or?
Each incident is a little bit different, but in the Bahamas incident, there were documented minke whales that also stranded. But in every one of these, Xiphias cavarostris, which is the Cuvier's beaked whale, is the most prominent of, there can be a range of species, but this is the guy who's most prominent. Yeah.
The beaked whales seem to go back a ways, their strandings. Are they less frequent nowadays? I haven't heard of any beaked whales stranding recently.
Well, the strandings, there have been stranding recordings for a long time, but there's a word that's used for the strandings that are seen in association with sonar, and they call them anomalous strandings. And the anomalous aspect is a more typical stranding, it's not so much for beaked whales, but for things like pilot whales or sperm whales. There can be an entire pod of animals that strand at the same time, in mass at the same place. And there, the sense is that there's a social component to the stranding. Either the entire group or some fraction of the group is sick, the entire group strands. The anomalous strandings of beaked whales occur over a huge stretch of beach. It can be, 50 miles of beach, and not all at the same time, but more in phase with the passage of the ship, as opposed to a single social group of animals. So that's the anomalous aspect of it, right? That it seems to have this broad temporal and spatial aspect that most strandings don't. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Going back to the noise of the ships in the area, how would you say that the noise attenuates distance from the ship? In the shipping lane, you expect it high, but 5 miles away, 10 miles away, how?
Yeah, that's a really important question, which has to do with how well sound propagates, from one location to the other. Now, when I talk about the San Nicolas site, which was made, the measurements were first made by the Navy for long-range submarine detection, right? That site is selected so that it looks out into the entire North Pacific. In other words, that was their goal, is to track submarines, across the North Pacific. And so the ships take these northern routes near Alaska, and it turns out that the sound, there's a waveguide for sound propagation, which comes right to the surface of the ocean there. And so the sound we're hearing at the San Nicolas Island site is really collecting up the sound of all the ships across the North Pacific. It doesn't matter, it's not related to local ships, it's the whole thing. And so its sound levels very rarely change. The statistics of it don't change much because it's averaging over such a big area, right? Many, many ships. If you make a recording in the Santa Barbara Channel, it's sort of this enclosed basin. It very much depends on, there being a ship close. Of course, there is always a ship not too far away because, there's just a steady stream of them coming through. The blessed thing about the site just west of San Clemente is there's a basin, there are no local ships, and the terrain of the California borderlands is so sort of up and down. It's these basins and ridges that cuts out the sound from long-range propagation. It essentially doesn't see all the ships that are affecting sites like San Nicolas Island site. So it is kind of local, but the this bathtub of the Santa Barbara Channel, I mean, it actually helps to concentrate the sound somewhat, and sort of rattle around inside that channel. So, but I mean, it's a consideration in terms of exactly where the ships are transiting. It will depend on how far away from that site it goes. So, yeah.
About 25 years ago, there was some work being done on the backside of Santa Cruz Island. I think it was military acoustic type stuff. Could you explain what they were doing and what's...
I wish I knew more. I wish I, in fact, had the data tapes if you know someone that does. I mean, I've heard of this before, that there was some kind of range, on the south side of the island. But I don't know that it's active now. Was it operated from Point Mugu or something, or do you know?
I think it was around Valley Anchorage, if I remember. There were certain areas that
Yeah.
wouldn't let boats anchor at
Yeah.
specific times. They kind of like closed a lot of the island. And Reagan might have been president then. I was curious if it was...
I've heard of this, but I don't know how to tie into that yet. I would love to get some data from that. And that would be a place where we could go back and see how things have changed. I would love to find out. But if you know somebody who knows something, have them send me an email. Yeah. Yeah.
Going back to your diving pattern tags.
Yeah.
You said that they were vocal. There was it two separate dives? There was a vocalization dive and a feeding dive, or so do they exhale at all? I mean, I know that some of the pinnipeds exhale. Do they? I mean,
Not
do they
during
exhale prior to their dive, or
well, these deep feeding dives, when they come to the surface, this is when they're really looking to, that's when they make the big blows, right? And they'll breathe, 4 or 5 times, and they're just recovering from their oxygen debt for having been down for so long. The dives in which they make the sound are pretty shallow, and this is part of the trickiness of, when they're in this mode where they're calling. When they come to the surface, it's a tiny little puffy blow. It's nothing that you'd see from a long way away. So it's when they're feeding that you really have these, columns of, plumes of vapor that you can detect. Oh. Yes?
Are the designs of ships changing, the propellers changing? Is there any move afoot to decrease the amount of noise in the ocean from ship designs?
That's a really good question, and there are only certain classes of ships where people have cared about noise, and you can imagine the Navy cares because they don't want people to detect their ships. Cruise ships care because it's quality of life for the passengers. Container ships, they don't care. It's never been an issue. Oil tankers, they don't care. So I think that what will come, I mean, the technology, there is a lot of technology on how to quiet ships. And there are more advanced propeller designs. There are more advanced ways of mounting machinery to decouple it from the hull, of sound insulating, around the machinery. And it's just a matter of saying, this is important. This needs to be taken into consideration. And when you talk to the shipping industry, what they don't want to happen is to be forced to retrofit their existing fleet. I mean, they would go crazy. I mean, if you said, okay, let's make a law to retrofit every ship, tomorrow, they would go crazy. But if you said, here is a spec for new ships, and you must meet this spec. If you were constructed after date X, you must meet this noise spec. I think they would just take it in stride. I mean, there are all kinds of specs like that for fuel usage, and so I think that needs to be done, and I have a feeling it's coming. There have been U.S. efforts to initiate that, but shipping is just this incredibly international, complicated scenario. I mean, you can have a ship that founders on a reef and it takes them a week to figure out who owns it. I mean, it's tricky. But I think if there are international agreements, that can come up with specifications on noise, that'll happen. And it's a matter of just awareness, and that's part of what we're doing here, right? I mean, if oh, this is an important issue, and everybody makes a little contribution, I think it'll happen. Yeah.
Don't the ports have
Yeah.
some say in the ships, for instance, Long Beach and Los Angeles?
Absolutely. I mean, you could do it that way by saying, for instance, there's already a regulation that says you cannot come into our waters discharging oil, right? I mean, that is illegal. To have a ship that's discharging oil, you'll get cited, right? Now, maybe you can't come into our ports discharging noise, right? I mean, it's another form of pollutant, right? So that's the kind of unilateral way to do it. I think people would prefer to have some sort of international body, set standards and then work it into the fleet. But that's kind of a 20 or 30-year solution. So, yeah.
If they slow down, does that help any at all?
That's a really interesting story, and my trusty graduate student Megan is trying to figure that out right now. And so we're monitoring ships at different speeds and how much sound do they put out. And so what you worry is, imagine that you've decreased the noise level a little bit, but the resonance time is longer. Okay, have we gained anything? Well, it certainly is a benefit in terms of ship strike. It's well documented. If you slow down, especially below 10 knots, then the whales can get out of the way and maybe you'll see it and go around it. But for sound, it's not clear yet. And so hopefully by the time Megan's finished her thesis in, what is that? Is that next week? Or, yeah. We'll have an answer. Yeah.
Is it possible to put some kind of emitter on the bow, the bulbous bow of a ship that pulsates, that it's not, adding tremendously to the ambient noise, but it will still give the whales? I've heard that there's so much distance between the bow of the ship and the engine noise and the cavitation of the prop that they can't get out of the way quick enough.
Yeah, well, in fact, there's a shielding effect because most of the noise is coming from the prop. And the bow, there's this big metal object in between the prop and something right in front of the bow. Right? Now, an interesting experiment was done along these lines, and I don't know if you've heard about right whales. Right? Right whales are the most endangered baleen whale. We have maybe 20 or 30 of them up in Alaska. Yeah, there are 300 on the East Coast, and so every right whale mortality is a big deal. And in fact, shipping lanes have been moved on the East Coast to avoid right whale feeding areas. So somebody had exactly your idea. A few years ago, they said, okay, what can we make an alarm that will tell the right whale ships are coming and then they can get out of the way? So they put a recording tag, much like the one I showed you on blue whales, on a right whale. And then as the right whale is submerged, they would play various sounds and see the reaction. So one sound they would play is a simulated approaching ship, large ship. And the right whale did nothing, absolutely nothing. Well, there are a lot of ships around, and if you went crazy every time one came by, you'd be interrupting whatever you're doing all the time. So the right whale didn't care. Sound of a ship, no, didn't touch it. So then they came up with a sound that was kind of like a siren on a police car, very novel sound. And the right whale immediately came to the surface. Right. Now, and the conclusion of the paper says, gee, it seems like a bad idea because, the ship's coming on, comes to the surface, boom, no. So unfortunately, it goes the wrong way. So, yeah.
What about possibly speaking the whale's language, so you just had a stop sign, like when you came up to a stop signal, and we see stop with our eyes, since they use their ears as their eyes,
Yeah.
not their eyes at all. If they just heard in their own language, stop, turn around, you've got a deadly intersection, because then we can make a conscientious effort. Are you,
Yeah.
is
Well,
that a solution?
I mean, that is hopefully, if we could meet here in 100 years.
Well, they're already doing it for elephants and wolves.
Yeah. Well,
And those
and,
are mammals, so I'm
yeah.
wondering.
No, but when I'm telling you about what we've learned about the different kinds of calls that the blue whales make, I mean, I consider that the first steps in learning how to speak blue whale, right? Because now, okay, we know when they're doing this behavior, this is what they're saying to each other, right? And it's this just teasing out the meaning of these sounds.
Inferring which
Yeah.
sound means which behavior.
Yeah, and to blue whales, it's reasonably simple language, let's say. There aren't that many sounds that they make, and so we're starting to tease that out. And so I would hope at some point in the future we could do that. I mean, that would be my dream. If I could, say, okay, I want the ability to talk to the whales. I mean, let me drink the magic potion and I'll do it.
Well, if I could share with you some work, I've been working on transcribing sperm whale parts to actually say this, stop, turn around. I'm working on humpback whales as well, killer whales. I was wondering if I could present this to you, you might read it sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. Yeah,
Thanks for your
yeah, it's a topic that I'm vitally interested in.
Me too.
Yeah, yeah.
Given the beachings that have happened here and many of the inferences that it is or is not
Yeah.
sonar.
Well, I think we just have a lot to learn about the ocean, from marine mammals, and this is one way to do it in the long run. Yeah, yeah.
One more, getting away from the ships real quick. You talked about clicks and whistles. How about breaching? That was maybe a form of communication. Have you been able to record that and study that at all?
Yeah, you mean the actual, here's the splash of the,
Right.
to be absolutely honest, we have not looked for it in our recordings, but it's an interesting idea. And some animals are more prone to that than others. I mean, if you've been around humpbacks, they just love to jump out of the water and they'll do it 12 times and the breach of a blue whale it looks about like this, It's, so, but there might be some interesting things there. Okay, well, thank you all for, being so patient. Okay.